So good afternoon, everyone. Today I would like to welcome to Let's Talk North Carolina Genealogy, Doug Brown, who is presenting with us for the second time. Hey, Doug. And since 2007, Doug Brown has served as the Public Service Manager for the State Archives of North Carolina. This position oversees reference and access for the records at the state archives. He has worked at the State Archives since 2001, starting as an intern in the State Archives search room and later fulfilled other professional positions working with county government agencies in the transfer and management of public records. Doug received his undergraduate degree in history from Davidson College and his graduate degree in public history from North Carolina State University. He was born and raised in Wilmington, North Carolina, but his family roots go back to other regions of the Carolinas, such as Rowan County, Person County, and upstate South Carolina. Let's give Doug a virtual welcome.
Well, thank you very much. It's good to be with you guys today. Thank you very much. Let me go ahead and start sharing my screen. And while I do that, let me give you a warning. Do not consider myself a North Carolina colonial historian expert, but as you know, I've been here at the State Archives for a while, if you heard, and so I've picked up a few things and be glad to share with you what knowledge I've acquired from being at the State Archives and learning more about our North Carolina's colonial history. So anyway, just go ahead and get started. So like I said, we're going to just try to give you a brief review of our North Carolina's colonial history. And I'll talk a little bit more about the records itself that we have at the State Archives, since that's a little bit more about what knowledge I can share. So there's basically, I see, three general phases or stages of colonial development. The first phase deals with the whole age of exploration in the Virginia Company of Jamestown, which covers from the 1500s to about 1663. And then there's the proprietary colony or period from about 1663 to 1729. And then we have the third phase, which is the royal colony, when the proprietaries turned over the colony to the crown, starting in 1729. And then that'll run up to about 1775 or to the American Revolution. So all these ages or stages were predominantly influenced, controlled by the British Empire, as you probably know. And they wanted to expand their economic, political, and cultural interests in the New World. France and Spain were also exploring the Carolinas during the 1500s and had made some attempts at colonizations, but they did not take off. But the story of the lost colony as a North Carolina is kind of what I remember. It's kind of ingrained in my memory. So those of you probably grew up in North Carolina like me, you probably know the story of Queen Elizabeth, Sir Walter Raleigh's attempt to build a settlement on Roanoke Island, and the mysterious disappearance where the lost colony went away a few years in as well. We're kind of intrigued by the stories of Virginia Dare, the Croatoan Tree, and we kind of celebrate and boast our own place in this colonial history. And we remember this romanticized version, as you see in this first slide. But for me today, I seem to be more interested in the history and development of those first permanent settlers who came down a few decades later after the Roanoke Island story. These are people who they abhorred authority. They longed to be self-reliant. They longed to be free from persecution and unjust economic and political systems. And you see this theme kind of exists throughout all these phases of the colonial development of the Carolinas, or especially North Carolina, all the way up to the American Revolution. Let's see. Where's my screen? There it goes, sorry. Okay, next slide here. So here's a map from the early 1600s depicting the coast of what is now, as you can probably tell, is the southeastern portions of the United States. The northern part, you can see at the top, you see the phrase Virginia written up there. You also see this term, Socoton was an Algonquin village on the Pamlico River. And this is, you can tell, is North Carolina from the Outer Banks. And then further south is the Carolinas, Georgia, and Florida. You know, it's referred to basically as Florida here at that time. Overall, it gives a really decent portrayal of what the early explorers found over the past 100 years. They found all these indigenous communities along these creeks and rivers. But especially in North Carolina, you see Roanoke Island here, you see the Outer Banks kind of jutting out from the coast. And then you see also up north, you see this little indention here, which I believe is the Chesapeake Bay, where the Virginia Company and the Jamestown Colony was started. So you see these two big issues that are confronting the colonists in the Carolinas. You see these indigenous communities living along these low-lying areas by the rivers. That's where there's fertile ground. So those are the places that the colonizers are coveting when they come over there. And then you see this rugged coast, these barrier islands, these narrow inlets that are kind of blocking the entrance to all these rivers in the northern region of the Carolinas. But over the next 100 years, disease and warfare really obliterate the tribes that were in the Carolinas, the Meherans, the Chawanaq, the Tuscaroras. But the colonizers really never can get over the fact that they don't really have any natural deep water ports or navigable rivers. And they didn't really find any but up between the Chesapeake Bay and what is now South Carolina. And they never really could overcome that whole lack of natural infrastructure. So in 1606, the London Company is chartered, Virginia is chartered, and its first permanent colony, Jamestown, established as a year later in 1607. You can see it kind of up here. It's written sideways on this map. I believe that's the James River. And that's where it was started. And then, but like the Roanoke colony in the Carolinas, Jamestown really struggled for the first few years. And in fact, they lost 80% of its population during this starving time. They did eventually recover and become permanent, and they started to really flourish in 1612 thanks to tobacco becoming this very lucrative product, where in large tobacco plantations were quickly spread, and eventually all the fertile land on the navigable streams was taken up by these few large and wealthy landowners. And as the amount of the available land to settle decreased, the population and the life expectancy of these colonizers really increased. So there's just this inverse lack of land, but more people. So what the settlers did, or the colonizers did, that were marginalized by these wealthy landowners, is they moved south. They followed these rivers down here, down south to what's now the North Carolina, to this region called the Albemarle. And this is the Albemarle Sound today, this little strip of water here. And so they follow these rivers down here, looking for land that they could settle on their own. And so Virginia actually, the colony starts to grant land to settlers to move down to the Albemarle region in the 1650s. We also see land grants between the Indians and the European settlers recorded in early deed books. However, the British monarchy really wanted to control the granting of land and what is they considered their property, and subsequently issued a charter to 8 Lord Proprietors to grant and control this land below Virginia. And so here we're at the second phase of the proprietary period. This begins with this image of the Carolina Charter, which was the important document in our state's history. So its genesis is tied to the whole restoration of King Charles II to the throne of England. As you may have known in English history, his father was executed. There was the whole Commonwealth bill, Oliver Cromwell, but they then eventually decided to restore Charles II to the power, to the monarchy. He did not really do this alone. It was an easy task, but he needed some support from nobility and the lords. So to compensate some of the lords that helped them, they looked west, and they were also involved in this New World exploration. And they saw the whole Carolina region as being an adequate means to broaden their economic interests. So in 1663, the Carolina Charter was written up and was granted, where they granted to 8 Lord Proprietors all this territory between the 36th degree and the 31st degree of north latitude of the North American continent, stretching all the way to the Pacific Ocean, which is roughly just below Virginia down to almost to Florida. As I think I mentioned, some of the lords are already involved in the colonization of Virginia and Barbados, and they saw Carolina as another opportunity to expand their operations. In 1665, the charter was amended, and they broadened the borders of this region to include the Albemarle region and go all the way down to St. Augustine, Florida. So under the charter, the proprietors were granted what's called Palatine jurisdiction over this new region of Carolina, which means they could set up their own government independent from the crown. And so the system was used by other remote regions of England, such as the county of Durham near Scotland, where the crown delegated responsibilities to the Bishop of London. So it's kind of in that same regard. But the laws still need to be consistent with British laws and customs. And of course, a portion of the profits will also need to be paid to the crown. At this time, when the charter began, there was already about 500 Virginia migrants and a few slaves already living in the region. But it's now controlled by the Lord Proprietors. And these were independent-minded settlers who were not really excited about this aristocratic rule being found to them once again. They left Virginia and were kind of happy on their own self-reliant world. And now the words was encroached upon by the British again. So the proprietors' intention was to hopefully establish a system reminiscent of feudalism, which they were accustomed to, and where they controlled the land ownership, and they in turn would rent the use of the land to colonizers. So now this next slide, we get to see an image of what's known as the Great Dismal Swamp. This is a region between the North and South Carolina border, and it's another, along with the Barrier Islands and the inlets, it's kind of another geographic feature that's played a role in North Carolina's colonial development. So this region really became a haven for indentured servants who were getting away from their service, enslaved people who were obviously trying to escape from slavery, religious dissenters like the Quakers, and indigenous people who were trying to escape the hardships of living under this Virginia plantation system and under the Lord Proprietors. So today the swamp is still mostly uninhabitable, really. Yet many colonizers found it as a great place to kind of get off the grid, so to speak, as we refer to today. Due to the very limited trade routes by sea or land, the people who settled here were small, self-sufficient farmers that adapted to the environment and initially tried to coexist with the indigenous people. And there's some evidence that exists that some of these inhabitants were in voluntary interracial relationships and continued and intermarried. The Virginia establishment accused the white and black residents of engaging in illicit behavior together, such as drinking and dancing and gambling and cockfighting. And they also accused North Carolina of actually permitting free people of color to vote. But the proprietary government, so they passed some regulations to try to go to battle these interracial behavior in 1715. But the evidence suggests that some of these laws were really ignored. Some people continued to do these interracial activities together. So the Virginia government was really, especially the government was really noted. They referred to the people as being uncouth, uncivilized, these North Carolina colonizers. They were labeled as lazy, undesirable, dangerous, backwards. Yet most were really these small farmers who lived in the community with less disparity in wealth and land ownership. And they also saw them as a threat that could possibly lure the lower class people in Virginia and the enslaved people to move down south to kind of escape this whole stratified social structure in Virginia. And they also referred to the people of North Carolina as being like sheep that having no shepherd. This Albemarle region was also a place of religious tolerance where the Quakers were able to settle, and they were able to gain some political influence as well. The Anglican Church didn't really get started until the early 1700s in this region and had little influence, and it was really slow to get established, despite really the efforts of the proprietors and the government officials to hopefully get it started as well. So in the first 50 years of proprietary rule in the Carolinas, the colony didn't really expand much from that northeastern portion of North Carolina, or this Albemarle region. We do see some colonizers starting to spread west into what's now Bertie County, Craven County, and then also spreading south into Terrell County, Carteret County, and Beaufort County. And by 1740, we even see some settlements attempted down in the southeastern portion of the state, where Wilmington is today, in New Hanover County and Bladen County. In fact, shortly after that proprietary period began in 1663, there was a group from Barbados who tried to settle on the Cape Fear River, but they really didn't have the full support behind the proprietors, and they really had a really bad relationship with the Cape Fear Indians. It was started out very hostile, and because of that, they fled, they gave up, and the region had this reputation of being unhospitable to the colonizers. And it remained relatively untouched by Europeans until the 1720s. So most of their attention, especially for the proprietors, was down to South Carolina, where the plantation system was established and rice, indigo, and cotton flourished. And these Barbadian colonizers actually went down to the Ashley and Cooper Rivers, where in 1670, where Charleston eventually developed. And you probably know the history of Charleston very well. And they were able to have more success trading with the indigenous people than they did in the Cape Fear region. But so by 1694, the proprietors were also encouraging more settlement on the Neuse and Pamlico River Basin, which are these two rivers kind of below that northeastern part, where Bathtown is today and New Bern. So you had French Huguenots from Virginia migrating south. You had German Palatines settled and formed the town of New Bern in 1710. However, these settlements really infringed upon the land of the Tuscarora people, which led to a violent war with the Tuscarora nation. By 1715, the Tuscarora was defeated and confined to the Indian Woods Reservation in Bertie County. You can kind of see on this map to the right here, you see Tuscarora Indians identified. So by that time, the threats of indigenous people was really diminished especially in the coastal plains. So that's where you start seeing the Cape Fear Valley being developed and establishments of the ports of Brunswick and Wilmington along the Cape Fear River. But they still weren't able to get rid of that whole bugaboo about the coast. I mean, it's still, the rivers weren't adequate compared to other places in other colonies, and the coast was always had its reputation as well. So it was really difficult for big ships to get through to the northern part of Carolinas. So we get now into our third phase, where North Carolina becomes a royal colony. Proprietary rule ended in 1729, and so 7 of the 8 lords sold their rights back to the crown. It actually occurred in South Carolina 10 years prior to this, and in other colonies to the north. But during this time, we see a lot of population growth over the next 40 years, with Germans and Ulster Scot migrants traveling down the Great Wagon Road from Pennsylvania down through Virginia to the Carolinas. We do see Scottish Highlanders coming through Wilmington and going up the Cape Fear Valley to what's now Fayetteville, to that region, to the Sandhills region. And so most, again, traveled either from the north or south into the Piedmont region, not directly from the old Albemarle region. So there was really not that much interaction between the Piedmont and the east. You do see on this map to the right, you see the Moravian communities who settled around Salem and Bethabara and Bethania. And then below that, you see Salisbury, which was a major town in the back Piedmont area, which was near these trading routes in the Yadkin River. And so you have the Yadkin River, you have the Catawba River, and the Piedmont, which flow into South Carolina. So all their really trade with the Piedmont kind of is concentrated more with South Carolina than with the old, more established part of the northeastern part of the state. And so there's not that much interaction. So ironically, the whole northeastern part became this whole despised aristocratic government, while the people in the Piedmont were the new self-sufficient rebel rouser people. And You see a culmination, for example, of this with the whole regulator movement. The regulator movement was this rebellion initiated by residents in the whole backcountry who believed that royal government officials were charging them excessive fees, they were falsifying records, and engaging in other mistreatments. And it's referred to their whole desire to regulate their own affairs. Well, unfortunately for them, Governor Tryon sent the militia to inland to help defeat these outgun regulators who were harassing their government officials and limiting their funds coming in. And so they were able to defeat them. They were really outmanned, and those who survived or weren't executed were able to take an oath of allegiance to the crown and were eventually pardoned. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about the records that we have at the state archives. So first, I'm going to talk a little bit about the colonial court records. So the whole, again, I mentioned, I think briefly, that the proprietors and the crown both wanted to maintain the system of English common law. And this whole court system is what oversaw the whole common law system. It was the highest court of justice in the colony. It was also an appellate court for lower precinct courts or pleas and quarter session courts to take their appeals. But it mostly saw like major civil actions in criminal cases that may be punished by death or loss of limb. It also solved a lot of administrative functions like the probate of wills and deeds as well. It was really comprised by the governor and council, the governor would be appointed by the proprietors and then later on by the crown. But later they did start appointing their own justices. The governor would appoint a justice, except for maybe the chief justice. There were some changes in rules, but mostly they met in what's Perquimans County today in Edenton. And then as the colony grew, you start seeing more circuit courts put out, where the circuit courts would go to towns like Bath, to New Bern, to Newton, which became Wilmington, and then even to Edgecombe Courthouse as well. And then, and then there's also, even to the 1750s, you see circuit courts going to Salisbury and New Bern. For cases that were not considered to be litigated under common law, you have the Court of Chancery, which covers 1670 to 1775, deals with cases about what is fair or what, according to principles of equity. The Governor and Council were also members of this court that oversaw that. And there was also a Court of Vice Admiralty, which heard maritime matters, including mercantile litigation and taking prize during wartime. So here we have an example of one of these colonial court records. These are actually available online on our webpage called the North Carolina Digital Collections, and they've actually been transcribed. So this document, hopefully you can read some of it. I know you can tell this is a good example of this colonial era writing. It's kind of hard to read, but it's where this man named Thomas Sparrow is setting free one of his servants named Philip Landers. And on the right, hopefully you can see there's a transcription of the whole letter where he talks about where he's kind of like on his last days of life, he's bedridden and he wants to free the slave or the servant, and talks about how he's been faithful towards him and just, and that he loves him and he wants them to be free. And this is written, you see at the very bottom, the date's kind of weird. It's got 17017. I don't know if that's 1717, 1701, but you can take your best guess. But on the right, like I said, there is a transcription. And this is part of an ongoing project that we have at the State Archives called Transcribe NC, where this was started during the COVID-19 pandemic, where we had volunteers who could help us transcribe these records, and we could review them and then put them online alongside the records that are the digital images of the records. And at the end of the slide, I'll show you that link to that website as well. And so also with the these colonial court records that I was just talking about, they were transferred to us in the 1960s from the Chowan County Courthouse. The State Archives, or what was then known as the North Carolina Historical Commission, was started in 1903. But there were many historians prior to that time were very motivated to help save colonial records from being lost forever. But during that time, the really only means to do that was to really transcribe the records, since they didn't really have the ability to preserve records or save everything. So you'll find transcriptions of colonial court records in this set of volumes called the Colonial State Records of North Carolina. It was published in the 1800s, and they're now available online on this link provided. We also have a set of these books as well in our search room. And another good one is another transcription of these early colonial court records from 1900 is the North Carolina Historical and Genealogical Register by Hathaway. Unfortunately, not all of the records survive, but we can certainly help track down the original if you found a good citation in one of these records, and we can hopefully, with the state archives, possibly we could find the original record here in the archives. Next, I want to talk a little bit about state agency records that fall into this colonial era. Probably the most notable one is the Secretary of State's record group. The Secretary of State was basically the chief record keeping office for the colonial government. And most of what they were concentrated on was to basically keep records of the government, as well as the ownership of land and transfer land. So they're the office of the office that provided land grants or land patents. You may have come across those in your research. And they also, during the colonial era, oversaw wills and estates and probate records. To the left is a portion of a will by a woman named Mary Fortson. That's kind of our notable, one of our most oldest records in the state archives. It's from 1665. It's, of course, written by a female who you might notice she did not leave her mark. She actually made her signature. And what's really interesting too is this is a woman who had property in the Carolinas and was leaving it to her children, which was kind of unique for a woman to have property at that time. Next, we have records from the governor's office and the governor's council. The governor was a royal office that was appointed by the proprietors or by the crown, depending on the time frame. And they also oversaw administration of the county. So we have lots of minute books and dockets and loose records dealing from that office in the colonial era. And then we also have the General Assembly session records, which was the legislative body of the colony. And so we'll have petitions brought to before the General Assembly, people expressing their grievances or concern, and also the bills that may have been written in regards to those petitions that were sent to the General Assembly. Next, we'll talk a little bit about county records. So the state archives is a pretty unique archives where we get a lot of records transferred to us from the county governments. So we have a lot of early colonial records from certain counties that were around in the colonial era. For example, this is something for Perquimans County. This is an excerpt from a book called The Record of Birth, Marriage, Death, and Flesh Marks. Goes back to the 1600s. You can see some dates here and maybe make out some of this information about people's birth or deaths or where they were born. For those doing North Carolina research, genealogy research, you probably aware that North Carolina didn't really start keeping birth and death records until 1913. So this is a really unique or rare vital record that was kept by a government agency. And in fact, they were supposed to do this, but yet it was not really well enforced by the proprietors or the crown. So unfortunately, this was something that wasn't done on a regular basis, but we do have these few records from Perquimans County, which I thought I would like to share. The state archives has also a lot of special collections. Special collections are really kind of a generic term for like non-government records. For example, like private manuscripts. So these are records that were in a private individual or family's ownership that was transferred to the state archives for permanent preservation. So the left here, where it talks about the Indians having killed one man, 200 of them salted. This is an excerpt from a collection called the Thomas Pollock Papers. It's dealing with the Tuscarora War. And so Thomas Pollock was this very well-to-do lawyer, planter, county official. And he moved to Carolina in 1683. And he was a deputy of two of the Lord Proprietors. and was involved with the Governor's Council, was probably on the Governor's Council longer than anybody else. So fortunately, we have some of his records here as well that kind of deals with this whole colonial era of history. And then to the left, this is a copy of a record from 1735, and this is part of our English records group, or the British records. So we also have a lot of copies and transcripts of records from the British that were in a British repository, like the British National Archives, or what was then known as the British Public Records Office. So one of the, I guess, issues with the colonial government is that records were supposed to be sent back to England for safekeeping. And so North Carolina did that to a certain extent. So there's a lot of records dealing from the colonial era that have been sent back to England. And then when the Revolutionary War came and went, and historians wanted to do look for primary sources dealing with our history, they've kind of found a lack of records, and this is why, because a lot of these government records were sent back to England. So all throughout the 1800s and 1900s, for often known, historians in the state government were always investigating about how can we get these records back. And so this example on the right is from the 1920s, where the North Carolina Historical Commission looked into getting copies of records dealing with North Carolina history that were in the British Public Records Office. And this specifically is the Albemarle County quick rent list from 1735. And so you see it lists lots of names of people who were paying their quick rents to the government. And so but you can see the writing is not contemporary to colonial era. It was copied by a clerk in England who basically, that was the only way to get copies, is to have some clerk rewrite these records down word for word. And so we actually paid someone to do this for us and get these copies sent to us. And there was also a project that was done again in the 1970s, 80s, where by this time Xerox copies were invented. So we were able to copy records and get microfilm copies of these records as well. So that's all I have for you today. As you can see, here's my contact information. There's a link to the North Carolina digital collections I talked about, and a link to our State Archives of North Carolina homepage if you want to get more information about us or how we run things. So again, that's all I have to present to you, but I'll be glad to answer any questions you might have about the history or the records that we have.
Well, Doug, that was just wonderful, and I applaud you. My head is spinning. I will be going back to watch this presentation again and definitely learn some things that I didn't know before. If you can just stop your share, Doug, and now if everybody would like to go ahead and click start video, then you're all welcome to come back up as we typically do. Everybody go ahead and do that so that we can get on here together. And Doug, we do have a couple of questions for you.
Okay, shoot.
If you're ready. So Taneya, I'll do the first one.
Okay, now I can do the next one after that.
All right. So we have a question from Kim Forey. Oh, and before that, let me just say a couple of things. First of all, we've had a lot of vigorous sharing going on in the chat. So just a reminder that to save the chat, you just click on the three dots at the bottom right of the chat box and then click Save Chat. And it will be saved to a folder on your computer that is called Zoom, and it will be saved with today's date and the word chat and probably some other little alphabets and numbers or something in there also. Also, if you would like to ask Doug a question on camera, just go ahead and use the raise your hand option or start waving your hands all around, but I don't think we can see everyone on the screen at the same time, so it's best to raise your virtual hand and that will move you to the first screen, and Taneya and I will see you. So, Doug, we have a question from Kim Forey, and Kim is asking, did the white traders need a license to trade or set up a store in Cherokee territory in the 1750s or 1760s?
Yeah, that I do not know for sure. I'm not, I didn't look much into the Cherokee interaction with the colonizers, to be honest with you. So I don't know
Is
if
there
they can do
somewhere
that.
that you might be able to point Kim to a certain record set or something to look into that?
Maybe start with NCpedia, or we can, that's a website through the state government heritage library that has lots of really good resources on North Carolina history. Again, it's NCpedia, NC, and then like Wikipedia is NCpedia.
Yeah.
And so they have a lot of good source information about our state's history. But if you run into dead ends there's a chat function you can provide with the state library, and they can maybe research it, or you can email us at archives@ncdcr.gov, and we can look into it and get back to you, perhaps. Or there's also a research branch that works through our whole Department of Natural and Cultural Resources that helps people research certain topics on North Carolina history, and sometimes refer people to them because they have done the research and can provide that information.
And I'm thinking that maybe if something like that does exist, then it might be in the county card catalog at the archives, maybe under miscellaneous or under licenses. Some of them I know have categories for licenses and things like that.
Yeah, there are licenses to trade records, but I'm not really sure if they go back that far.
Okay.
Kind of a wild west, so to speak, at that time period. Right. So I'm not sure if they did anything like that official, but you never know.
And Taneya has a question from Terry.
Yes. Yeah, so Terry's question for you, Doug, is, would post-Revolutionary War settlers have been given land grants for their service? Or did they purchase land tracts during that time frame? And specifically, the Rowan Cabarrus County area near Salisbury.
Okay. Yeah, so anyone could apply to get a land grant for any vacant land that they came across in North Carolina. With Revolutionary War Service, there was the bounty land warrant system, and that was for land that was in now Tennessee. I think Washington or Davidson and Sullivan County were the two counties that were primarily set aside as bounty land for Revolutionary War Service for Continental Army, not militia service. So, and those records are fortunate with us, and you can search by name for a land grant. So the whole land grants are in our online catalog by name, and so the bounty lands aren't really separated from the regular land grants. So they're all together and part of the whole Secretary of State record group. But you can search by name, use our online catalog. And then there's a really good website called NC Land Grants. I don't know if it's .com or .org, but if you just Google NC Land Grants, it should come up.
That's David McCorkle's site.
Yes, David McCorkle's
site. Yes. Mm-hmm.
And I thought first that I think Tennessee has done some project where they put a lot of their land grants for military service on their site.
Okay.
I don't know the specific URL, but no.
I don't think Melissa is on here today. She would probably be able to answer that. I don't see her though. Okay, well, I think you just answered James Wade's question. James, if that was not a full answer to your question, just put another little note or either come on up on camera and we'll get some more for you. So the next question is from Stephanie Dahl, and I was on it and then I just somehow clicked off of it. Here it is. Were all English records retrieved and available in North Carolina archives? And then she also asked, where would you suggest looking for England's records?
Okay. So, yeah, it was the whole English records concept went over for probably over a century. I mean, it was started after the Civil War in earnest by the Secretary of State's office, where they and they're the ones that compiled that Colonial State Record Group book that some of y'all might be familiar with. And then there was another attempt in the 1920s by the Historical Commission. Those are to get those written copies from us. And then there's another one done in the 1970s and 80s. So there's been 3 main pushes to get records. So I'm hoping that anything with some connection to North Carolina history was discovered and copied in some format to be used. And so, yes, and then so those records themselves are kind of grouped by the government agency that kept them. So there was like a colonial office that kept British records. There was a treasury office. There was an audit office. There's like 20 or 30 of them. It kind of goes on and on. And so, and even when they get to the 1970s and 80s, they kind of expanded their search beyond the main British archives to like libraries and museums and other places throughout England, like going to like Liverpool. They have these records still in the Liverpool Public Office and the British Museum. And so I'm hoping they've done a very exhaustive search, but to find anything with North Carolina history, but it was all done by humans, so there's always a chance of human error that occurred. But on our webpage, there is if you go to a section dealing with finding aids, you'll find something that says records in foreign collections, and that'll bring up a list of PDF finding aids that kind of go into a little bit more detail about all these different agencies in the British archives that we have copied. And the finding aids kind of lists briefly what each record is about. It's a little convoluted. So if you find something or want more details, we can try to help you remotely or over the phone. Oh, thank you, Taneya.
Thank you. And we have a comment from Kim Forey saying she so appreciates your maps, and I also enjoyed your maps and plan to go back and take a look at some of those. So
you can tell I like maps, I guess.
Yeah, and if I could add, Shar commented that seeing that was very helpful. The migration patterns helps explain some of the DNA.
Definitely. I see, James Wade, you came up on camera. Was your question answered well enough, James? Okay, very good. Okay, if there are other questions, please raise your virtual hand if you'd like to ask Doug something on camera or make a comment. I don't see any hands up. Do you see any, Taneya?
No, I don't see anyone's hand.
Okay. Well, I really enjoyed the talk, as I said, and there was a term that you used, and this is what I get for depending on my brain to remember it, because I was going to ask you what it meant. It was something, I didn't write it down. I think you said something about the backwoods folks or something like that. Does that ring a bell?
Let me get back to my notes.
It was just a casual reference, and I don't think it was exactly backwoods, but it was something like that. And I was going to ask you who that referred to.
Were you talking about the regulators when I was talking about the dismal swamp, the people living in the?
I don't know. I don't know. Don't worry about it, because I'll email you later when I watch the video again. There is a question about a link to the North Carolina archives. Taneya, yes, can you drop that right quick?
I'll drop the link real quickly. Yes.
And so we have a new question from Clyde. He's asking, do earlier records from quote unquote burned counties exist at the state archives?
Yes, if they didn't get burned, they're most likely with us. So yes, they don't recall of any counties that have much of their older records. I did talk about the only one I can think of it for an example, or like most counties will keep their early deed books. I mentioned something about in the 1650s, before the proprietary period, there are some deed books where there's deeds between indigenous people and white colonizers. And so those deed books are still with, I think it's Perquimans is one of those that has those original records. So that's probably the only exception I can think of like an early colonial record that's still with the county, whether it's a burned county or one that did not have any record loss. But typically speaking, we have any county records from the colonial era almost up to the early 1900s with us.
Not too long ago, maybe about a month ago, I had called the Chowan County clerk's office, and whatever, I think I may have been asking about something in the early 1800s, and she told me that everything from that period is at the state archives, that they don't have it there at all anymore. So,
and something about a slave owner, I see.
Yeah, Marnie has a question. If a slave owner gave land to a former enslaved person, would that be recorded and where?
I hope so, yes. If that would, first place I would check would be the deed books in the county where the land took place, yes.
And
there's also like miscellaneous enslaved people records as well. It could be something that if it didn't survive in a deed book, you could check there as well.
Yes. And we have a comment from Adrian. I'm surprised Adrian didn't just come on camera and come on and say this himself. But he says, I very much appreciated the early explorational and colonial history, interesting coverage of motives and intentions of people settling in the areas. Thank you for that comment. Kim has another question. Was there migration from Chowan to the interior?
Yes, I think that's where you see people moving west into what's now like Edgecombe County, Halifax County. I think those, and I guess there's probably some migration down south from Virginia still as well, people coming there. So I guess it's probably from both areas, people moving from the Albemarle west or people moving south from Virginia. As I mentioned, I think I'm from Person, which was then Orange County. So a lot of our genealogy goes back to Virginia. So I see where at some point they came down south.
Okay.
Chose North Carolina.
More questions rolling in. I don't know why everybody's being shy today. James Wade wants to know, are there separate Quaker records?
Not really with us. That's probably, I think Guilford College is the institution that has a lot of records dealing with the Society of Friends or the Quaker religion. So Guilford College is where I would probably start that question and see what they have. We have really, go ahead.
Oh, no, go ahead. I'm sorry.
Yeah, but yeah, we might have the government records that might deal with the interaction of people who are Quakers with the government as well, but not records themselves specifically to the churches. And we do have church records as well. I don't recall much Quaker records going back that far, but I think Guilford College would be a great place to consult for that.
James, I'll just share with you that I've been doing some work in Chowan and Perquimans County recently, and Perquimans County court records do involve several documents related to Quakers and enslavement that I just happened to come across because they weren't categorized in any way. So I'm not sure what angle you want to see Quaker records from, but go to Perquimans County and you'll probably, hit gold along the way. So Taneya, you want to get that next?
Yes. And so Lynn is asking, are there any records of Old Tryon County?
There are some. I don't really know what all we have at the top of my head. I think we have some land records going back to Tryon County and maybe some court minutes, but we do have some I've come across, but it's not much, unfortunately.
Hey. Well, that's all I see. Oh, there's one more. Now, Mary, you always come up and ask.
It's the last word.
Mary, go ahead. Go for it.
I would think
you're on mute, though, Mary.
Oh, she wants to talk. All right.
Yeah, so it'll be recorded. Mary, you're on mute.
Okay. I'm unmuted.
Okay, there you
go. So I had some ancestors that were captains of militias, local militias, pre and during the Revolutionary War, both for the purposes of defending the colony and also in some of the Native American skirmishes. Does North Carolina have records of those militias, and where might I look for them?
We do have some records dealing with militia, and I would look at, there's a collection called Military Collections that has what's called troop returns. And those are actually been put online on the North Carolina Digital Collection webpage. If you go to that webpage, there's a category called troop returns. That would be a good place to start. And you can like search by county and it should pull up any lists associated with that county.
Okay, perfect. Thank you.
All right. Oh, there's another one. Sabina Newman. Sabina is asking, are there records of bills of sale of enslaved individual for Wake, Granville, and Craven counties?
You may want to take this one, Renate.
Well, I'll just say yes. And I will say that Wake County actually has a website dedicated to this. And of course, I don't have the link ready, but maybe I can grab it in a minute, or just Google Wake County slave bills of sale and it'll come up, or slave records. But also if you are working with those county records as found on Family Search, you will pull up the county from the Family Search catalog and then see what they have. Usually they have a category for called something like records of slaves of free people of color, something like that. Or you may just have to go through court records to browse for those documents, but they are available. People Not Property is another site that you can use to find these. So Google is your friend. Google the term and the county that you're looking for and see what comes up for you. And last but not least, I always recommend the Family Search Wiki. Pull up the Family Search Wiki and see what it has to offer for what you're looking for.
Yeah, Granville specifically, there's a lot that survived dealing with enslaved people for Granville County. And I think there's a fair amount for Craven, but not much for Wake, unfortunately. But for Granville,
well, that Wake County site is amazing, though. It really, I wish I had something to look for there personally. I don't, but if you do have Wake County ancestors who were enslaved, then you may, hit gold again.
Yeah, those are great links y'all provided. That's perfect.
Mm-hmm. Yep. And you're welcome. Did I see another question, or was that it?
I think that was it for right now. Yeah.
Okay. Well, today I learned that our friends are shy. We wouldn't have known if we didn't put this new setting on that we had so many shy friends. I'm shy too, y'all, but I have to show y'all myself every time we come on here. But Doug, I just can't thank you enough. As you were, you guys, if you haven't seen our season 1 episode, is it 5, Taneya? Episode 5, I believe. Season 1, episode 5 show. Doug was with us then, and he discussed everything that the State Archives has to offer. And of course, now that's been a couple of years ago, but I think it'll still be very relevant if you go back and watch it. You'll learn a lot about how to use the State Archives and what is available there for us as North Carolina researchers. So, okay. So we just want to tell you all quickly, we actually had a little a video spot that we were trying to prepare for you all, but we had some technical difficulties. So Taneya is just going to remind us or talk to us about our upcoming chat on November 20th.
Yes, can you hear me all right? Yes. So on November 20th, we're going to have our next research chat, and the theme is a family affair.
It's a family affair.
Go, Renata. Classic song. But we chose this topic because this is the time of the year, right, where we start to think about being with family and what family means to us. And so we're interested in having you all share, what family means to you and sharing something from your family. Renata, I'll let you give a little bit more detail about the different ways people can express that.
Yes. So we, like Taneya said, family can mean something different to each of us. And so we just want to give everybody an opportunity to just share maybe a picture, maybe a document, or even just tell a very short 1 minute or less story that that tells what family means to you, or especially around the holiday time, you know, how do you and your family celebrate? Really just whatever angle you want to take on it. I will just be sharing a picture of the people that make up my immediate family and just talking a little bit about what they mean to me. Taneya is going to be sharing a story about something that recently happened in her family that kind of solidified what family means to one of her relatives. And so just anything creative that you would like to bring. And also if you are a person who has trouble with screen sharing, or you have any concerns about that, you're welcome to send us your picture or item that you'd like to share. You can send it to us ahead of time. Taneya is about to give you the email address, and we'll have it ready for you so that you can share on the 20th. Taneya?
Yes, so I'm putting the email address into the chat now.
Okay.
All right. Yes. So I'll put the email address into the chat. So please feel free to send that ahead of time to us, as Renate said.
NC Summer Series 2020 at gmail.com. So I think that what I do.
I was just going to say, I also put the link in for people to register. So please go ahead and register for that session.
Yep, you can register now. And of course, you know, we'll be posting all kinds of reminders and tweets and sending emails and all the things that we do. But you can go ahead and get that registration knocked out now, and you won't have to think about it again. And so, Taneya, I think for the first time in a long time, we're finishing up just here
right on time.
Yeah. It's been a while. So we just like to thank everyone for joining us today. Thank you to everyone who is going to see this in the future on YouTube. And we look forward to having you join us for our next chat on November 20th so that we can talk North Carolina genealogy.